This is the 19th season of Bass Talk Live. BTL is presented by Bass Cat Boats, Strike King Lures, Aftco, Pro Guide Batteries, X-Zone Lures, Shoreline Boat and RV Repair, Spro, Gamakatsu, Big Bite Baits, The Bass Tank, Denali Rods, Beatdown Outdoors, and Sunline.
BTL coming at you.
Good morning and welcome to another exciting edition of BTL Bass Talk Live, where we are going to talk about bass fishing. And yes, another in-studio guest. That makes 2 in 2 weeks after Matt Steffen, after his foray at Lake Eufaula in Oklahoma for the Tackle Warehouse Invitational stop by. It is B.A.S.S. Conservation Director and long time. Well, you've known Mark with Bass Zone for what, 25 years?
30-ish.
30-ish?
Yeah.
Do you remember the first time you ever met Mark Jeffries of Fish? Were you on the team? Were you on the Smith Action Optics Bass Zone Jersey team back in the day?
Yeah. It goes way back before that.
Before that?
Oh, yeah, way back. The concept for the Bass Zone, Mark used to live in my neighborhood, and he came over to my house after we got to know each other.
How'd you get to know each other? Like through the local club? Or
He saw me in my yard one day, and I had my bass boat in the garage. He just stopped, and we started talking.
Was he UPS in it back then?
Yeah, he worked for UPS then. And we just got to talking, and we got to talking about fishing. And he eventually joined the same bass club that I was in, our North Oklahoma City Bassmasters. And we just got to know each other. And somewhere along the line, I can't remember the dates, but he came up with this concept of using the internet to try to promote tournament fishing in Oklahoma. And a lot of the concept for the Bass Zone, or what at that kind, I think it had a different title. FishOK.com was started at my kitchen table. And Mark, we talked about all this stuff till 10:30 at night, and then he'd go home and just work on it all night long, trying to figure it out, and come back a couple of nights later and go through the same thing. And that sort of evolved into ultimately involved into the Bass Zone.
Was he still as, let me see a word I want to use. Was he still as passionate in those early days as he was? I mean, just,
oh yeah.
Bull in the china shop.
So. Very much so. You know, he saw an opportunity and decided this is the future of, the media side of.
You think that would ever happen if you hadn't seen the bass boat in your yard and stopped? It might not have never come to fruition.
Who knows? I don't know. We, that was back when they had a big tackle show in Tulsa, boat and tackle show. And I already knew some of the people in the industry here in Oklahoma with, Falcon rods. So, over the years, I filled in a time or two on a radio show that we did together. And because the studio was right up the road from my house there in Norman, just over the years, it's been a fun relationship. Mark's been a good friend. It's interesting just to see how it's all evolved over the years.
Very interesting. Yeah, we're working on our internet connection. It just came back. It was out there, but we're back. At the time, were you the fisheries biologist, director? What was your title for Oklahoma? Because when I first met you, you were still with Oklahoma, had not moved to Bassmaster.
I was a fisheries research biologist for the Oklahoma Wildlife Department for 25 years. And then I moved into administrative roles the last 5 or 6 years of my career. And then I took the job with B.A.S.S. 9.5 years ago.
That was already 10 years ago?
Almost.
Does that feel like almost 10 years ago, G?
No.
That seems like yesterday, where it was like, oh, Gene's going to Bass.
Right. Yeah, it was a pretty seamless transition. I'd been working a lot with Bass over the years. My research kind of led me into working a lot directly with B.A.S.S. and I've been an avid bass fisherman since I was a little kid. So it all just kind of, the timing and everything just fit together. But yeah, it'll be 10 years in November.
What percentage of fisheries biologists that were in your position through Oklahoma? So there's 50 of them then?
Oh, way less than that.
There's not one for every state?
Oh, yeah. Well, you're talking about
weren't you the head?
I was the assistant chief of fisheries when I retired from Oklahoma.
Okay, so
I was the number 2 guy.
Let's say top level fisheries guys for every state.
Right.
What percentage of those guys are avid bass anglers / tournament anglers / understand how all the tournament scene works? Because we're gonna dive into that today. We're covering a lot of topics.
Relatively
today,
few, yeah. I think most everybody that got into the fisheries field got into it because they love the outdoors, they love hunting, fishing, that sort of thing. As far as being avid bass anglers, there's not very many. I can just off the top of my head, I can only think of 2 or 3 that I think are kind of in that category. But I think most of them are avid sportsmen of, one form or another. Just may not be, avid tournament bass fishermen.
Well, I mean, you'd have to be an avid outdoorsman to go into that occupation. I mean, if you hate nature and go into fisheries biology.
No. I think in some states, just depending on how the state is structured, they may be actually appointed positions rather than somebody
I see. It's not
rather than somebody
that
promoted up to that job. They may have gotten the governor or somebody higher up may have appointed them to that position as an administrator.
Okay.
Because once you get up to that top level in any agency, you don't handle fish, you handle people. And that's a little different skill set to be able to navigate that. And so sometimes those jobs, you wind up with people that may not be as avid anglers, but they are very good at managing people. And that's kind of where you deal with.
So then to kind of wrap this up, if someone was to say, what are the top 3 things that you do? What are your top 3 duties as the Bassmaster conservation director or conservation director for B.A.S.S?
Okay.
What are your top 3 responsibilities?
That's pretty easy to answer. There really are 3 components to my job. The first one is within the Bass Nation, our state affiliates, the state chapters, each one of the states has a state conservation director who is a volunteer, is a bass angler who just has a passion for this resource. But they're not biologists. They don't have experience dealing with state agencies or with policy or with those kind of things. I help them on working on state and local issues that they have to deal with. The second part of my job is I represent B.A.S.S, the company, on a number of different boards and councils that look at fisheries policy, mostly on a national level. I was in Washington, D.C. last week with the American Sport Fishing Association's Government Affairs Committee. We went to Capitol Hill, talked to legislators about some legislation that's in Congress right now. We do that kind of stuff. Then the third part of my job is working within the company at our tournaments, working with our staff, our tournament staff, to make sure that they're following what we call our best management practices, the fish care protocols that we put in years and years ago to make sure that our live release rates are as high as we can possibly get them. So those are the 3 components of my job.
So like when you go to or see an Elite Series event or a Bassmaster Open or BASS run event, there's a method to the madness behind the tanks and what's in the tanks and what the people are doing and how the bump tank works and how many bags they're giving out and the fact that you have like all of that stuff, I guess, falls ultimately under you. You're the one saying, hey, this is how it needs to work to best protect or best have the highest live release rate.
Right. And that's anybody that's been to any of our events, if they've competed in whether it's high school, college, Bass Nation, Opens, or the Elites, the weigh-in process is essentially the same for all of those tournaments. The size, the number of contestants can vary, but the process of handling the fish is pretty much the same for all of the levels of tournaments that Bass puts on. And those procedures have evolved over the years. But the system that we've got now we think is a pretty good system. It keeps the fish in water as much as possible. It reduces the time they're out in the air. We control oxygen and temperature in the tanks and the live release boats. We try to speed things through the weigh-in so we can get the fish back in the release boat so they can be turned loose. And if you look back over at least certainly the last 10 years, probably more than that, our release rates average over 95%. Now, a lot of people will say, well, that doesn't account for delayed mortality. Yeah. Well, we know that. There's going to be some fish that die as a result of the tournament process. But on average, when you've got a 95% live release rate, even if some percentage of those fish die a week or so later, the impact to the fishery, to the whole bass population in that lake is minuscule. And all the studies that have been done over the years, going back, all the way into the 70s, we've seen a very steady progression and improvement in the survival of fish that are released after tournaments. So that from a state agency standpoint, when they look at a whole bass population, not one fish at a time or count the 5 or 6 that float up at a boat ramp, when they look at the whole bass population, they don't see any impacts because of tournament angling. And so we keep doing what we're doing because we think we're doing a pretty good job. There's a lot of people that criticize us for, well, why don't you go with the catch, weigh, and release format because it's so much better on the fish? Well, part of that is Bass's business model depends on having fans come to a weigh-in and watch people on stage with holding up fish. The sponsors expect people to show up, the fans. The television audience likes to see the fish. And since we don't have any information from our state partners that says we're having an impact on the bass fisheries, then we're going to keep doing what we're doing.
Makes sense.
But I mean, you look at at our competitors, they only have one level that does the catch, weigh, and release. All of the rest of the tournaments that MLF runs are a traditional 5-fish weigh-in. But their business model for the BPT is different. It's a made-for-TV kind of thing. And so it's not so much about how the fish are handled as it's what's your end game there in terms of, the business side of it. Yeah.
I've always wondered about the live release boats you get. Are there trap doors? There's trap doors on the bottom of those things?
There are. Each of those boats
You're talking the pontoon boats.
It's a big pontoon boat with a 600-gallon tank on it that we have compressed oxygen going into it. We put ice in there to regulate the temperature. And when that boat is filled to capacity, it goes out, and there's 4 trap doors in the bottom, and they can release fish in 4 different spots.
Oh, there's 4 trap doors on the bottom. So just because you see the live release boat in an area doesn't mean that all the fish in that live release boat got dumped there.
Right. And our goal is, we're obviously not going to be able to take those fish home because we don't know where home is. We don't know where they came from.
Yeah.
It could be 30 miles away if it's a big lake.
There.
Right. But we want to get them away from those real high traffic areas, the marinas, the boat ramps, some of those coves and places where there's always a lot of tournaments. We just want to move them out into more open water. And then when the fish come out the bottom of the boat, they've got a 360-degree choice as to which way they're going to go and find their way back to a shoreline or a brush pile or whatever it is that they want to live in. And so it's really, we're not trying to completely redistribute those fish. We just don't want to stockpile them all in one spot.
Yeah.
And a lot of the states, there's a handful of states, the state chapters, the Bass Nation chapters that have release boats. Some other large tournament organizations do. There's other ones that use trailers. They have live release trailers where they can take the fish around and turn them loose at several different boat ramps. And the whole idea is just kind of to redistribute them so you don't turn them all loose at the same place every time.
I had Alan McGuckin on last month, and he was talking about some of the research that he did in Oklahoma. And he was talking about the Lake Thunderbird study, and I think you've been on and talked about that one before. But are there certain species of bass or certain types of fisheries where the fish are way more likely to go and disperse after they have been released after a major tournament, whether it be a local or regional, a Bassmaster tournament, and other characteristics where they're more likely to stay within a small radius of where they were released?
Yes, it varies. Smallmouth tend to travel more.
So they're like, I'm done. I'm over it. I'm going home.
They move away.
Okay.
They may or may not go home. We'll get into that in a minute. I've got some really cool stuff that's coming up on that. Time of the year makes a difference.
Oh, really?
In the springtime, they tend to move away faster. If you put them in the hot summer or in the winter, they tend to stay more localized, and they'll disperse eventually, but it takes them a lot longer. The other part of that is it way back in the back of a cove, or is it on the open water main lake area? So there's some differences there. Depends on the habitat. If there's plenty of good habitat and there's plenty of food, they don't have a lot of reason to leave.
This is my problem with Grand.
And so it's exactly right. You wind up, these fish don't have to leave if until at some point the numbers build up to where competition says, okay, we got to thin things out, and then those fish will start to move out.
Yeah, 50 yards down the bank in Wolf Creek.
But then there's some that'll just keep going and keep going and keep going.
So I'm not wrong when I'm thinking, hey, you put a ramp in the back of Wolf Creek that has a big shad population, a lot of cover, a lot of 200 to 300 boat tournaments that are releasing hundreds and thousands of bass in this, where it had been in Echo Bay before, which the bass, you go out in the mouth of Echo Bay and now you're on the main lake and you can go wherever you want. So there is some truth to the fact that you are keeping a bigger population of those fish in Wolf, just using Grand specifically.
I don't know if it's necessarily bigger than what was already there naturally, because if you have habitat, if you have food, either the fish you add are going to bully out the other ones, the native fish, or they're just going to keep moving. And so I think it maintains some kind of a stable quantity of bass that are in those areas. And then the excess fish are just going to keep going. They're going to move out until they find a place they can call home. And there's studies now that are seeing that bass kind of have personalities, in that there are fish that are going to move and move and move miles and miles, and other ones that are more homebodies that are not as likely to want to move very far. And so anytime you release a bunch of fish, there's going to be this kind of a wide spectrum of fish that are, some of them are going to stay put, some of them are going to take a hike right away. When we did the study at Thunderbird, we had one fish that was recaptured 2 weeks later, 7 miles away.
And it's hard to go 7 miles on Thunderbird.
And this was way up in the back of the Little River too. So he had navigated some pretty crazy twists and turns to get there in a matter of 2 weeks. But, people think, well, gosh, that seems awful fast. Well, you think about it. If a bass is swimming, let's say 3 miles an hour, which is a kind of a casual walking pace.
So that's how fast, like if a fish is swimming somewhere, it goes 3 miles an hour.
They can easily swim 3 miles an hour. So in 2 or 3 hours, they could go 9 or 10 miles. So if they choose to, they can go a long way. And there's what I was alluding to earlier. There's a couple of studies that are being done with smallmouth now on the Great Lakes. They've radio tracked smallmouth. They've got a series of receivers all over the Great Lakes. and they put radio transmitters in some smallmouth that were released at some tournaments. And some of those fish have traveled like 300 miles in a year.
Wow.
They've made, you're talking about fish that come out of Sandusky Bay and swim all the way to Canada.
Really?
And back, or all the way down the shoreline into New York waters and back.
Why?
Well, I don't know. You'd have to ask the smallmouth that question.
Are they migrating, or is it individual fish?
It's individual fish that have these radio transmitters. So we can't track all of them.
I know, but if you did like 5 in that area, are all 5 going 300 miles, or one will just take off and just straight dory?
That's what I was talking about, that personality. Some of them just take a hike, and then other ones go 2 or 3 miles and call it home, or they go out to an island or a place. And in some cases, they may have gone actually to where they were caught. We don't know that.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
But that's part of the next phase of this study. There's Ohio DNR and now Michigan DNR are looking at some similar studies where they're going to try to put more transmitters in more fish to really get a better idea of just how far they move, when they move, that seasonal thing. Mm-hmm. They're going to be able to collect fish both from tournaments and from electrofishing, so they can see if they go home or if they go to just random places. There's a lot of cool stuff going on.
When you say home, you mean like the salmon in the river thing? Like they just have this weird or not echo, but they have this weird location thing where just like you feel comfortable at your house. That's where they were There's spawned, raised, and that's where they feel comfortable.
There's research going on now that try to figure out what, salmon. They know that a lot of what they're doing is using smell, the sense of smell, to tell them which stream to go back to.
Oh, really?
And there seems to be some relationship there, maybe with bass as well. But typically a bass has a home range, an area that they know pretty well. They know landmarks. They know how to navigate. They know where the brush piles are, or where the rock piles, or whatever it is. And they kind of know that area. Now, if you move them in a tournament 30 miles away, now they don't know where home is. But there are some of these fish that somehow, and we're not real sure what's going on, they've figured out how to get back to at least where, I got a clue. I think I know where I am now. And then they actually can get back to more or less where they were caught, or at least within that home range where they used to live. Huh. So there's a lot of cool stuff going on right now. And the Bass Fishing Hall of Fame and AFCO are helping to fund some projects this next year, I think, to kind of expand on some of that research that's going on to help us answer some of those kind of questions.
AFCO's big into that as far as supporting
they are, yeah.
Like that's a no BS deal. They got, they sponsor the show, but Casey,
they are
with them on the Hall of Fame board.
When you talk about companies in the fishing and boating industry that have what I call a conservation conscience, they are top of the list.
Yeah.
And they put a lot of money into conservation research and projects, both freshwater and saltwater. I think last year their 10% pledge is they put 10% of their profits into conservation efforts. And from the B.A.S.S side, they provide $25,000 to us every year.
Wow.
That we then create a grant program and give that money out to Bass Nation chapters around the country that submit proposals to do, fish conservation, bass conservation type projects. And we're going on, I think this is the 5th year now. We just completed the scoring of this year's projects and notified the winners actually last night. So we'll have a news release probably coming out pretty soon on the projects that were selected for that AFCO funding. But they are great. They're great to work with. They don't do it just for the publicity and the notoriety. They do it because it means something.
I've been there where Casey is looking at you and he goes, Gene, what what can we do to help? And there's like no one else around. There's like 5 people around, and he's actually like, and you look at what Bill is like semi-retired with AFCO, so he can serve on like every single major saltwater fishing water board that you can get on.
Yeah.
Is that not a fair statement? Like that's what, like you said, they're very,
it is. I mean, it's part of that company's DNA, you know, and I think it goes all the way back actually to Bill's father. Mm-hmm. So it's a family thing, and everybody in the company buys into it, and they put their money where their mouth is. And it's been a great partnership for us, and even outside of what they've done through B.A.S.S. In the freshwater world, which they've just got into the freshwater stuff just in the last 5 or 6 years, but they're really trying to make a difference, and we really appreciate their support.
Is it hard to get people passionate about conservation, Gene? Like that's got to be hard.
It is. It's until it's something that happens in your backyard and affects you personally. A lot of times it's hard to get people fired up to do anything. On the corporate side, there's just not many companies that think beyond the bottom line and what profits are going to be next year or the year after. You know, we're talking about doing things that make a difference for 5 or 10 or 15 or 25 years. And in the corporate world these days, that's hard to sell. And as companies get swallowed up by bigger and bigger organizations and holding companies, a lot of times the conservation ethic kind of gets pushed to the bottom of the list. And you know, on the angler side, we have had difficult times in getting people fired up. You know, on the hunting side of things, there's people want to take away your guns. And so it's a little easier for hunters to sort of rally together and have common cause and do things to help their sport. Nobody's trying to take away your fishing rods. And so until something bad happens in your backyard, it's hard to get people motivated to actually get involved and do things. And that's one of the challenges that we've had over the years, is trying to get the anglers focused on doing things, especially when you start talking about political issues, because everybody hates politics to begin with. And there's a mistrust of government. So it makes it even tougher to get people motivated to dig in and do the things that need to be done.
There's people in here saying, "Oh, my wife tries to take my fishing rods away." Who would you say are some of the most conservation aware anglers with B.A.S.S. right now?
Ooh,
I don't want to put you on the spot there, but is there anybody that always kind of impresses you?
I'm probably going to miss some of them.
Well, that's fine. I know it's a.
The two that popped to my head that really kind of stand out. Mark Menendez has been very involved in the war on carp.
We've had him on BTL numerous times.
When the Asian carp issue, the invasive carp issue came along and hit Kentucky Lake, that's his home waters, he got really involved and has stayed engaged. He's gone to Washington to testify. He's worked, on fundraising efforts and things like that. So Mark has been a very good spokesman. Now, Mark actually has a degree in fisheries, so he's got a little science background too, which helps. Another one that a lot of people may not realize is Mike Iaconelli has gotten pretty involved in some issues. He's gone to Washington. He's testified about some things, supporting some legislation. He's tried to get some people fired up over some local issues in New Jersey, working through the Ike Live fans to get people, fired up about kind of that write your congressman kind of thing. So there are a few of the guys that have really stepped up and really kind of gotten involved in it in that regard. I think, for the most part, most of them are very passionate about the sport and about the lakes that they fish. Sometimes it's hard to, fishermen are kind of hard-headed, and they believe what they believe, and sometimes it's hard to make sure they understand what the facts are and not just what they've heard on social media. Because there's an awful lot of misinformation on social media and a lot of people with agendas. And that makes it tough too, when there's so much noise out there trying to make sure people understand what the real facts are. But for the most part, most of the guys are pretty good about, when we ask them to do something as far as, supporting a conservation initiative, they're willing to help out.
Well, you brought it up. You said there's a lot of misinformation or a lot of facts. We've got a list here, and these are some of the some of the common either misnomers or things surrounding bass and tournament fishing, conservation.
Right.
Like, I mean, I think if you just take 5 smallmouth at a time and dump them in Grand, you're going to be catching 30-pound limits of smallmouth out of there in no time, right, Gene?
It hadn't worked.
Yeah,
because there's hundreds of guys that have tried it. Probably.
And I mean, if the lake down the road, if they just stocked more freaking fish in there, the thing wouldn't suck anymore.
Right. Yeah.
Just stuff like that we're going to get into.
It's not that easy.
All right. We're going to take our first break of the show. Gene Gilliland, B.A.S.S. Conservation Director, BTL. It's a Tuesday, right? It is a Tuesday, right? BTL April 25th.
It is.
It is BTL April 25th with Gene Gilliland. We'll be back. We're going to address some of this. Like I said, I got a whole list of stuff I want to hit you with.
Okay.
We'll be back right after this.
The new Puma STS has been redesigned from the ground up. With the angler, design, function, and performance in mind, nothing on this new offering was compromised, and the only thing carried over from the previous version is the name. Based on the Soft Touch series hull that started with the flagship Jaguar, this new model is nimble and performs incredibly well at all speeds with either a 250 or 300 horsepower engine. Featuring a new 96-inch wide-body footprint, this hull measures out at 20 foot 7 inches in length. Industry-leading design coupled with tournament-winning performance. The Puma STS from B.A.S.S. Feel the rush.
Everything you need, one legendary brand. Top on Strike King.
So I'm a big guy, a lunker, a 2 sandwich eating kind of man. And on behalf of all of those bigger, I gotta say it once and for all, it's bad enough that the fish look smaller in our hands. The last thing we should have to worry about is getting quality outdoor clothing that fits. AVCO, any fish, any water.
Elite Series Pro Daryl Gleason here. My Pro Guide batteries keep me going on those long tournament days and long practice days. Always plenty of juice, never fail. The best part about Pro Guide batteries, it's the people behind the company. They have over 40 years experience in the battery business, keeping all of us fishermen out on the water longer, catching more fish. Check them out at ProGuideBatteries.com.
What's up, Bass Talk Live fans? Brandon Polnick here. And ever since I won a couple Bassmaster Elite Series events on X-Zone Lures, I've been getting a bunch of questions of what makes them so special and different. And really, the truth is, it's in the details. The little details, things like no cheap fillers in their plastic. That gives you more lifelike action, more realistic and vibrant colors. But don't just take my word for it. Go to www.xzonelures.com and check them out for yourself.
The great thing about the new Sensation soft plastics from Big Bite Baits, heavily scented, super soft, buoyant, comes in 7 great new shapes. I've got a couple of them of my signature series, the cliffhanger worm and the ramtail craw. Great for a flipping jig, football jig, swim jig, all that. Several other great shapes. Really excited about it. We've worked over the last year, catches fish all over the country, and I think it's going to catch fish for people everywhere you try it.
The Spro Little John crankbait has been around for almost 15 years, and it is one of my go-to crankbaits whenever I need a fish in the boat, so you can never have enough new colors. That's why Spro's coming out with a handful of new colors, including Pearl Shad, which has this bleached out white look, but it's got this pearlescent, really, really pretty We've got copper shad, which looks amazing in the water. It's got that purple flake on the back, really, really pops in the water. And then if you want some real pop, we've got sparkle shad, nothing but sparkles all over this thing. And then last but not least, we've got the matte sexy shad, just a really different looking color for a crankbait. So you want to give them a little different look, that matte sexy shad is definitely the one to go with. All these colors are available in the original Little John and the MD.
Shoreline boat and RV, dock rash, storm damage, collision repair, that deep scratch or gouge from trying to access that secret creek. Shoreline boat and RV can get your prized possession back in mint condition and looking good on the water, fast. All repairs are done in-house, so they're able to get your boat or RV back to brand new, quickly. All Shoreline's work comes with a rock-solid warranty. Find out more at shorelineboatandrv.com. Kansas City, Austin, and Tulsa. Welcome back, BTL on a Tuesday. B.A.S.S. Conservation Director Gene Gilliland, and I'm going to hit you with a list of 5 or 6 hard-hitting questions that the bass anglers across the country have wondered. You're the guy who can make this happen. Why is this not happening at lakes near me? Or why is this happening? Or just all the stuff that you typically get to hear about. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because, bass anglers are the most rational, coherent, reasonable group of people on earth, right?
By far.
There's no hard-headed bass anglers. We're all open to suggestion and scientific fact, right?
100%.
All right.
Okay, but I gotta do something before we get too far. And I don't know if the camera can see this or not. This picture right over here.
Oh, you can take it off the wall.
Oh, can it?
Yeah, Matt Steffen actually that picture has gotten more publicity on BTL than any other picture. That's the Babe Winkleman autograph.
This is Babe Winkleman pictured. Matt and I were fishing on a lake in Minnesota. We were up there at one of the Angler of the Year tournaments, and that was going on at Mille Lacs. And so earlier in the day, we went fishing, and we're out there on this lake in the middle of nowhere in Minnesota.
Bitty lake.
Yeah, it's a 1,200 acre lake. And we're fishing along, and it was a nice, pretty, calm day. And all of a sudden, Matt says, "Wait, listen." I'm like, "What?" And he says, "It's Babe. It's Babe. I'd recognize that voice anywhere." And sure enough, Babe Winkleman is on that lake filming a TV show that day.
There's one other boat on the entire lake.
And this is like, 1,000 yards away. Matt hears the voice that resonates from his childhood TV memories. And sure enough, Babe's out there making a TV show.
Yeah. You set it on the floor there. Yeah, so I did not get that. That autograph came when I was probably 8 to 10 years old at the Decatur Fishing Expo. I waited in line. Babe was signing autographs at a card table. So that's how I ended up with that. And then obviously one of my most treasured possessions has stayed with me. I've listened to some of his interviews, and it always goes down the Lyme disease road with Babe. He's very passionate about tick bites and Lyme disease. It's affected his family drastically. So, all right, are you ready to get to some of these? What do you want to call this segment? Not truth or dare. That's what we did it would be myths or
myths and misinformation.
Myths and misinformation. All right, the first one, Gene, is that stocking fixes everything. I hear that a lot. Like, man, they forgot about my lake, right, or they overstocked something, but primarily it's that, man, you got to stock more fish in it to catch them. You can't catch what's not there.
Right. And biologists, state fisheries agencies have been their own worst enemy on this one because they stock a lot of fish. There's states that stock a lot of bass. And so people make the assumption that, well, if they're stocking bass in Texas, then we must need to stock bass in Illinois or in name a state. So it balances out. You're not putting more fish into the fishbowl for anglers to catch. Now, there are some exceptions, like if you have a crazy drought and the lake refills, or if you have a fish kill from some disease, or a hurricane comes along or something like that. Yeah, you're kind of starting over. Your fish bowl doesn't have as many fish as it can support. The carrying capacity isn't met. But stocking doesn't cure those problems. It's just like with deer or turkey or any other kind of critter. Habitat is what makes the big difference. If you've got good habitat, if you've got good forage, nature will take care of itself in terms of the numbers of bass that are being produced on your lake. Of course, almost all of the lakes, the southern part of the country, it's all man-made reservoirs. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of times these reservoirs fluctuate a lot. Somebody else like the Corps of Engineers or somebody, TVA, whoever is controlling the water levels, those lakes weren't built for fishing anyway. But as those things change, it changes from year to year. So you don't necessarily have a constant recruitment, a constant supply of fish coming in. Natural lakes are a little more stable typically because you don't have quite as many crazy variables. But stocking is very seldom the answer to poor fishing. Habitat is really the key, whether it's artificial habitats or natural vegetation comes in, that sort of thing. And so and over the years, a lot of state agencies have sort of kind of shifted their focus now to where they're looking a lot more at habitat enhancement projects than they used to, because a lot of our lakes, especially man-made reservoirs, they're getting old.
Yeah.
And the habitat's declining. And so if you want to maintain quality fishing, you got to do a lot of work on that side of the equation, because we know that we can't just keep throwing fish in there. The stocking programs that a lot of states have, we've got one here in Oklahoma, stocking Florida bass, but it's not to put more fish in the lake. It's really to influence the genetics of the population so that there's the potential of catching more quality or trophy size fish, kind of that top end of the population. So it's not a numbers game as much as it is a trophy aspect or a quality aspect.
Okay. So you mentioned the focus on habitat, whether man-made or natural. Is that because it allow or provide safety for the small fish to be able to get big, whereas you just get, I mean, if you're in an open field,
you got to have two things. You got to have a place to hide so you don't get eaten, and you got to have food that's the right size for your little mouth. And hopefully then over the summer and into the fall, you've grown up enough so that when you go into that first winter, when things kind of get cold and food gets scarce, you got enough food to survive and make it through that first winter.
Okay.
If those conditions are not there, your naturally spawned bass are not going to survive very well. And the stocked fish certainly aren't going to have much chance of survival. So you got to have those other components first before any of it matters. And, you know, in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't take very many bass to produce tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of fry compared to what a hatchery can stock in a lake. And so if you've got the right habitat, nature will take care of the numbers game for you.
Okay. That makes sense. Next thing that you always hear, what did you call it before when we actually kind of went over this list before? You called it bucket biology?
Bucket biology. Yeah. That's kind of a term that a lot of fisheries guys.
I'd never heard of that.
Bucket biology is where people put fish in a bucket and transfer them to another lake.
That's like you go fishing at 10 killer, catch a couple good ones, and all of a sudden the fish you catch go, boy, this lake doesn't look anything like it when I ate that shad 5 hours ago.
Yeah. It's, a bucket could be a live well.
Okay.
You know, people moving fish.
Which is illegal, right?
It is illegal in every state to transfer fish into public waters, but it happens all too frequently. And unfortunately, it's certain parts of the country, like you go out west, they move walleye, they move northern pike, they move other kinds of, species. In most of the southern states, the southeast especially, it's black bass that are being moved around from from one lake to another. Some places it's largemouth, some places it's smallmouth. But the biggest problem we've had now in the last, say, 10 years are anglers moving what is now called the Alabama bass. This is what people used to call the Coosa River spotted bass.
Okay.
They have been identified now as a whole separate species, and they have different characteristics. In the Coosa River, they get pretty big. They're home range, and people love to catch them, so they thought, hey, let's move them somewhere else. In a couple of places they've moved them to, they've done fairly well. Lake Lanier is the probably the best example. They were moved from, I think, Lake Altoona. Eventually they moved over to Lake Lanier. But in other places where they've been moved, what they do is they hybridize with the native species. They hybridize with the largemouth bass, and eventually the Alabama bass just reproduce in such numbers that it kind of pushes the largemouth bass into the fringe areas and reduces their overall numbers. But the really worst part is that they hybridize with smallmouth very readily.
Really?
Now, the first generation, that F1 hybrid generation, there's some big ones. They'll go 5, 6, 7 pounds. But once you get past that first generation and you start mixing and mixing and mixing, you wind up with a bunch of mutts, and you wind up with a lake full of little spotted bass or Alabama bass that have essentially eliminated the smallmouth completely. Oh. There are some lakes in North Georgia that no longer have smallmouth bass at all because the Alabama bass have just completely taken over. A lot of the biologists in Tennessee are just scared to death that these things are being moved around, and it only takes a couple of live wells full of these things. They're pretty prolific, and they're very aggressive. And there's lakes on the Tennessee River like Watts Bar that has a very high percentage of these things in them now. And the one that just scares me to death is that they're in the Cumberland River drainage,
like
Dale Hollow, where the world record smallmouth came from. Yeah. And that's the kind of thing that if people keep moving these fish around, it threatens the smallmouth bass fisheries in Tennessee and North Carolina and Virginia. I think they've been found in drainages of the New River in Virginia, which the New River is a renowned smallmouth fishery. And you wind up with a gazillion of these little, 1-2 pound spotted bass. Now, in some places they say, well, this lake was really crappy before. So this is, at least it's better than it was before. Maybe, maybe not. But the problem then is, well, people want to move them to the next lake and the next lake and the next lake. And before you know it, people moving fish like this have screwed up all sorts of things. And, it's happened with forage fish too.
Mm-hmm.
We just saw the blueback herring fisheries there in South Carolina. Bluebacks are not native to freshwater, and they've been moved in. They were moved primarily for striper bait. And it completely changes the nature of those fisheries when those forage fish get in there compared to the native shad. And there's other places where when they've moved certain kinds of bait fish, it's those unintended consequences. Maybe they prey on the eggs and fry of young sport fish. Maybe they outcompete the sport fish for the little plankton stuff that everybody eats when you're 2 inches long. And that's where we talk about this bucket biology, people moving fish thinking they're doing something good or kind of for their short-term benefit. And in the long run, the results can be catastrophic. And so we're really, a lot of the states now, especially in the Southeast, are really concerned about this Alabama bass thing and trying to make a big push to educate anglers to not move fish.
Okay, I'm going to play devil's advocate here, Gene. Wasn't Ray Scott doing bucket biology back in the day? Wasn't he taking trucks of, I remember this in the history of Florida bass and distributing them out west? Or who was that was doing that, was taking the Florida bass and giant aerated containers and taking them out to other fisheries across the country?
Well, Florida bass were moved by state fish and wildlife.
Okay,
agencies.
so that was actually done.
Yeah. Of course, if you go far enough back, black bass aren't native to the, west of the western part of the country.
Okay.
The west of the Rockies. And so the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, or whatever they were called way back, they hauled fish to Oregon and Washington and California and places back in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And people moved black bass all over the world. I mean, they're in Italy and France and Germany and Spain and
South Africa
and, all kinds of places. So that the foreign trade aspect is a different deal, but Florida bass were originally brought to California, and when they made such a big impact in those lakes in the San Diego area, a lot of the other southern states decided, hey, let's try this. Texas went and got some Florida bass in the early 70s. Oklahoma did, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, other states started experimenting with stocking Florida bass to try to produce those trophy size fish. Now, the difference there is you're talking about a Florida bass and the largemouth that are super closely related.
Okay.
And so you don't really have near as much of the negative consequences.
That's my question.
As you do when you bring in a species like the Alabama bass that is quite a bit different.
Changes the whole dynamics of the thing. You don't have something that
yeah. And the Alabama bass, the part of the reason they're having such problems with them is that their spawning range, they can spawn earlier or later. So they overlap with everybody, and they're very promiscuous. They'll spawn with anybody. So it's a real challenge for the fishery managers especially across the Southeast, and people moving fish around.
What's the difference between is there a difference between a Florida strain largemouth and an F1? We hear a lot about F1s.
Right.
What does that mean?
F1 is the first generation cross between a Florida bass and a northern largemouth. So when you take the Florida and the native or the northern largemouth and you cross them, that first generation hybrid is what's called an F1.
Okay.
And when you in genetic terms, when you make that first generation cross, you get what's called hybrid vigor, which it happens in corn, it happens in cattle, it happens in a lot of different critters and plants, that the hybrid cross inherits good things from both parents.
Gets big like a Florida bass.
Gets big like a Florida.
Aggressive like a northern strain.
Aggressive and can withstand colder temperatures like a northern bass. And so the F1, now they may not have the ultimate top end size that a pure Florida has, but they still they have the potential of getting bigger than, say, the native northern largemouth.
So what are they catching down at Ivy? The hell are those? Are those F1s?
Most of those are F1s. Some of them are pure Floridas. When Texas stocks, they stock pure Floridas.
Okay.
And given enough time, they grow into trophy size fish. Once they spawn, chances are they're going to mate with, depending on the lake, they're going to mate with a northern bass, northern largemouth, and then you've got the F1s.
Okay.
But you can also buy F1s.
Okay, that's what I'm saying. So you hear stocking. Hey, we put X amount of F1s in this
a lot
pond.
of people. There's a couple of companies in the country in the Southeast that are making their own F1s, the tiger bass.
Oh, so that's the same thing as a tiger bass.
Yes,
an F1.
The tiger bass is a trademark name of one of the companies' F1 bass, and you can buy them, and they're very expensive. So you can't buy very many if you want to have stock very many of them. But that's what people are doing, and stocking those in an effort to try to produce more trophy size fish. The problem with F1s, though, is that once they spawn, now you're starting to dilute those genes. They're not F1s anymore. You lose that hybrid vigor stuff, And so every generation you're diluting out some of those Florida genes. So the real benefits are really just from the ones that you stock in, assuming they survive, which I had this discussion with somebody the other day that said, why would you spend thousands of dollars on stocking a bunch of fish and you've got no warranty? Yeah. You don't know, your survival rate might be 5%, but you don't get a discount because of that. So, and it's a long-term gamble. On average, it's going to take 10 years to grow a 10-pound bass.
Pound a year.
So if you stock these fish, even and under ideal conditions, they'll get up to that size maybe in 6 years. Okay. But it's still kind of a long-term deal. You stock them, and it's going to take a while before you see any results from your the money you spent.
So the majority of the fish that are stocked in, you're saying F1s are expensive.
Yes.
So when you say we're stocking Floridas, or when you hear a fisheries department say they're stocking X number of Floridas, they're not stocking F1s. Correct. They're stocking Floridas in a lake pure Floridas in a lake that's predominantly northern strain.
Depends. Some lakes have been stocked so long
you got all sorts
that you don't have a lot of pure northerns in there anymore. Anyway.
But that's ideal. Ideal would be bunch of healthy population of pure northerns, right. Introduce healthy population of pure Floridas. You then get an extra entire cycle of the gene pool there, right. Because I'm sure you have some Floridas that still mate with Floridas and some northerns with northerns, but now you're creating a ton of F1s.
Well, and you still got those pure Floridas that have the chance of growing up to be big too.
Yep.
So you hope they grow up to be trophies. Then that F1 generation can grow up to be almost as big a trophies. Yep. But if you don't continually keep stocking, you lose those benefits after just a few years.
So after how many years? Like if you're vigorously stocking it, how long before?
We did back in the 90s. I did a bunch of Florida bass research here in Oklahoma, and we would stock a lake that did not have any Florida bass in it at all. We stocked Florida bass for 3 years, and then we monitored to see what would happen. And because of our climate, a relatively small percentage of those Floridas can even survive from year to year because we're just too far north.
What's a relatively small percentage?
5%.
5% survive. So if you stock 100 Floridas, 5, right. What do you consider survival?
Well, if they make it past their first year.
Wow. 5% are going to make it past their first year.
Yeah. But after 6 or 7 years we stocked 3 years and then stopped. After 6 or 7 years, the percentage of Florida bass had dropped to almost nothing because the nature had kind of culled them out. There were some F1s that were kicked in there, that made it through, and some of those fish persisted, but the pure Floridas pretty much died out after 6 or 7 years. So what a lot of states do that stock Florida bass, like Oklahoma, like Texas, they have to go in and restock every year or 2 or 3 to try to maintain some percentage of Florida genes in the population. Otherwise, nature kind of takes care of things and wants to kind of,
it's like a garden. You have to continue to plant your garden and weed it and cultivate it. So if you stock 60,000 Floridas, I just did the math, which I should have been able to do this in my head, Gene, but I wasn't. You've got roughly 3,000 of them will make it a year out of the 60,000. So you see these giant number of fish and you're like, this lake's going to be.
Let's carry this math out even further. And this is the kind of thing that people just don't think about. On average, let's say 25% of those fish are going to die of natural causes, or anglers are going to take them home and eat them, whatever.
Okay.
Some reason, 25% of those are going to die.
Those are ones that survive.
Right.
So now let's say now you're down to 1750.
Okay. The next year, take off another 25%. The next year, take off another 25%. and keep going, because every year you've got natural forces that are killing off those fish.
So when you get down to it, let's say you see the big grip and grin from hey, caught a 12 pounder. Let's use the buckle as an example. Caught a 12 pounder out of our buckle.
Mm-hmm.
That fish was stocked 6 to 10 years ago with 60 to 100,000 other little Floridas that are all happy swimming around in our buckle going, look at how cool this is.
So when you do that math and you start out with this huge number, people see, well, they stocked 100,000 Florida bass. Okay. After, let's say 10 years, because on average, it's 10 years.
Let's do it. So let's do 100,000. That's a good number, right?
All right.
So after the first year, you've got 5,000, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. You're down to 5K. After 100,000 were stocked. Your first year, you're down to 5,000.
Right. And then take 25% of that number, 25, and do that for 10 years. And you get down to where you've got, by the time you get to 10 years, you're down into 20, 30 fish. Okay.
4, 3, 2.
Now.
Yeah, you are.
Now, here's the other kicker. Only half of them are females.
Oh.
So now,
because the males don't get that big.
The males don't get big. So cut that number in half.
So there's like 5 out of 100,000. There's like 5 females that make it to 10 pounds.
Right. So that's why those great big fish like that are relatively rare. And it takes so long and it takes so much effort to get there. So if I'm a state fishing agency, this is it's a long-term gamble and it's darned expensive.
Yeah. So why would you
to produce 5 fish? But here's the part that nobody can answer is, what are those fish worth to you as an angler?
Do you got people? Yeah, I'm spending thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars chasing one of those 5 fish,
because
spending
they know
money
it's
in
there.
The community, spending money on the boat ramp, putting gas in my boat there, buying the vessel, buying the boat permit for the state, buying all that stuff.
So it's hard to put a value on, what, the fish is out there. What's it worth to you to go out and have the opportunity? You may never catch it, but that you've got the opportunity to catch it. So that's where the states run into this. If we're trying to satisfy, and I hear this all the time, people say, well, bass fishing brings in so much more money. Why don't they do stuff for me? Well, if you're trying to satisfy the trophy angler, that's a very expensive proposition.
Oh God. Yeah.
If you're trying to satisfy just the general bass angler, of which there are a lot more, they're not as focused on catching that 10 pounder. They just want to go out and catch some bass. And then you've got all of the other anglers out there that just go fishing. They want to catch crappie or catfish or walleye or whatever. And so from the state standpoint, they got all these different groups that are yelling at them saying, I want. And the license dollars that are coming in have got to basically help all those different groups. Now, something we talked about before we got on the show started, you were talking about tournament anglers. Tournament anglers are a very, very small percentage of license buyers. In our world, though, that's who we focus on. So we think of tournaments as being this huge thing. But anytime states have done studies of license buyers and say, do you fish bass tournaments? 1 or more bass tournaments a year. I mean, it could be somebody just fishes like a charity event.
Or a Wednesday nighter.
Yeah. It's like single digit numbers.
Really?
Compared to the total number of anglers that are buying fishing licenses.
So why would they cater to such a small percentage?
Because they're very loud.
Okay.
They complain a lot.
Shocker.
And I've always thought that there's probably, when you look at the money coming in on the excise tax on fishing tackle and equipment and boat fuel and that sort of thing, that they pay a disproportionate amount of that. Maybe not a majority, because certainly their license dollars aren't a majority. It's a small percentage. But the excise taxes that the state gets to help do fish management is based on the sale of tackle and equipment and motorboat fuels. And I think that tournament anglers probably spend more. So their contribution to that tax money coming in is a little higher. Now it's probably not a majority of the money coming in when you look at it that way, but it is a pretty significant amount. But the other thing that I've always tried to, anytime I've talked to biologists and administrators from other states, trying to get them to work with the bass anglers, is that there's not many other anglers out there that are as passionate about their sport and about wanting to make the resource better. So anytime that we can get the state and the bass tournament guys, the bass anglers working together, we're way better off.
Okay.
When they're butting heads, we don't get anything done. But when everybody's working together, that's when good things happen.
Can we go back to this 5 giants out of 100,000 thing?
Sure.
So then why is it, well, you can use an OHIV, but there's a couple ponds around Oklahoma where it seems like you have a much higher chance of catching a 10-pounder. If that's the standard, what are the factors? Are you having more in some fisheries? Is there like less predation? Or is there a higher percentage of survive? Like what makes some lakes really good and get big fish where 20 miles down the road, you could have the exact same thing and the numbers are completely different?
Every lake's different. Every lake is different. And that's hard for a lot of people to understand that, well, why can't my lake be like Lake Fork?
Yeah.
Well, until OHIV came along, there's not another lake in Texas that has produced the numbers of fish that Lake Fork, the big fish that Lake Fork has. The combination of food and habitat and water levels and vegetation and all those kind of things was just right. And in the case of Ivy, with the drought and the low water levels and the fact that it's out in the middle of nowhere, never got any pressure, these fish grew up. Nobody was ever catching them. Add in, dare I say, forward-facing sonar has changed the game a little bit. But every lake's going to be a little bit different. There's lakes here in Oklahoma that we stock Florida bass in for years, thinking that, man, everything looks right, but they just never really
took off. And then other ones, it's like, bang, things just really made a difference. Then you'd have like a 90% survival rate in those. No, you still, that's about across the board.
When the studies that we did, we had, I think the high survival we ever had of getting fish to a 1-year-old was 40%.
Oh, that's huge.
But most of them were a lot more like the 5 or 10% range.
But that's natural selection, because then if you have too many, then it prevents the potential for big ones to get bigger, right?
Yeah,
because that's the stunted.
Right. If you've got too much competition, then the growth rates are not going to be as good. But so every lake's a little different. The water quality, how they're operated, in a lot of places, the Corps of Engineers, or TVA, those lakes are built for flood control or for hydropower or whatever. And fishing and recreation is down the list. And so it makes it very tough for the fish managers to do their job, because they don't have control over all of those things that they need to control.
Let me ask you this. I was talking, I think it was Steve Kennedy even. Amistad saw a big boom, and I know there, rumors of chemical spills on the Mexican side and stuff that really devastate. I don't know, but it's not as good as it once was. Falcon, we see cyclical. We see all these lakes. I think it was Steve Kennedy I was talking to, and he's like, Steve, he's like, dude, green equals energy. And I just want to see if this is true or not, in your opinion, as a top level biologist. So when you have the drought and the low water, the genetics of the fish in the lake, and then it's down for an extended period of time, you have what you talk about, fish habitat, bushes, trees, all sorts of, but it all has green, and green is converted into energy. And then boom, it comes back after 5 or 6 years. All that energy in the water for the plankton and the little fish and the hiding and all that stuff and all the nutrients in the earth with the decomposition and all that, like that is what, like those lakes are not good because, hey, there's big fish in them that no one goes to. Those lakes are good because there was a drought there for 5 or 10 years. So much energy grew up on the bank, and now boom, there's all this energy that's in the water with all this greenery and all these nutrients. Is that in a roundabout way accurate at all?
That's, yeah. The one thing that's missing is that when the lake is real low during the drought, now everything is compressed into a smaller volume of water, so that the predators have an advantage of being able to get to the forage. And typically the growth rates are very good. But nobody fishes for them because the boat ramps are a mile up on the bank. Right. So nobody's fishing for them. So the fish grow and grow and grow. Then you put an extra 20, 30, 40, in case of falcon, 50 feet of water on top of them. You flood all that cover. Now you've got what biologists call the new lake effect.
Yep.
Where you get this boom, this pulse of nutrients,
is what Steve was calling energy, I guess,
that feeds the whole food chain, just explodes. And so now those fish that were kind of confined in a much smaller volume of water can go anywhere they want. They got an unlimited food supply. They grow like crazy. They start spawning their little brains out. So now you're producing the next generation, and things can really take off for those few years after the refill until the next drought, which unfortunately for some of those lakes, like on the Rio Grande, somebody else is pumping water out for irrigation, or you have natural droughts and they'll go back down another 50 feet. And so you kind of have that cycle start over. Where you get lakes like a Lake Fork that is very constant level, it seldom fluctuates more than just a few feet. Really bad droughts, I think, what was it, 2-3 years ago, it was down 6 or 7 feet. But for the most part, lakes like that, through their history that stay fairly constant, you get more vegetation growing. You get the cycle is more regular. And so as long as you've got a lot of nutrient input, which Lake Fork does, because there's a lot of dairy farms in those counties around Lake Fork.
Oh, no joke. That's part of the reason why Fork is so good. It's a very
nutrient rich system.
Yeah.
And when you've got a lot of nutrients coming in, you grow a lot of shad and a lot of bluegills. And so when you got
shad and bluegill,
when you got lots of forage, you can grow lots of bass.
And it also seems like the best lakes have a lot of places that are hard to get to. Sam Rayburn, Toledo Bend, Falcon, OHIV, Fork. I mean, even a Gunnersville with so much grass and that, like, there's a lot of places that those fish can get to unmolested.
Right. And especially like when a lot of lakes are new, like these 2 new lakes that they're building in Texas, the flooded timber and stuff will be so thick in them that there will be fish that will never see people for years because the habitat is impenetrable. and so those fish can have a chance to grow up to big sizes.
Okay. So the fact that, I'm thinking US Open on Lake Mead, obviously we're going through a massive drought there on that, in that entire system there. But why are there so many small fish on Mead? Like, is that because of the lack of cover on it, or why do they not?
Lack of nutrients.
Okay.
You think about the Colorado River lakes until you get farther downstream, they're really clear.
So it just gets stripped of nutrients.
Well, there's just not, everything that runs into it's running off a desert.
Okay.
So there's not a lot of nutrients there
Same thing, Steve. There's no energy going into the lake.
Right. So when bass do spawn out, when they do have some sort of successful spawns, the growth rates tend to be very slow because there's just not enough nutrients there to produce the forage fish.
That's why farm ponds are so good.
Yeah.
There's a ton of nutrients going in typically. You have a lot of vegetation. You have fast growth rates. You have... Okay.
Yep. There's that
Yeah,
whole,
that makes
whole
total
food,
sense.
That whole food chain thing, you got to have the whole. If you got breaks in the links of that food chain, then things don't happen right.
But you can look at a Havasu like that, but Havasu has a lot more vegetation around it with the cattails. That river, I think, is a lot where it is there has a lot more stuff running into it, right? Plus, haven't they done a bunch with fish habitats on Havasu as well?
They've done a lot of fish habitat especially with artificial structures and stuff, but that really doesn't produce more fish. That helps aggregate the fish that are there. But when you start getting further downstream, the further you go downstream, the more chances you have for nutrient inputs, like from the towns and cities and casinos and all that stuff that are their wastewater treatment plants or whatever, or there's people fertilizing their yards. And that,
so that actually helps it. It doesn't kill everything in some instances, depending on what's going in there.
Right. To a point, I mean, typically like on farm ponds and stuff, a lot of times we see too many nutrients.
Yeah. I never thought about this.
Homeowners association ponds that are always just pea soup green. It's because everybody's fertilizing their yard and it's all running in. You typically don't see that sort of thing on bigger bodies of water just because it's diluted enough. But the smaller the body is and the more developed it is around it, where you've got the opportunities for a lot of excess nutrients to come in.
Okay, so on the flip side, I'm just keep asking about fisheries. Why does the Ohio River so tough and suck so bad and not growing big fish? Because you got a ton of stuff flowing into that. You got dirty water. It seems like you'd have a lot of nutrients. There's grass on it, dude. You catch a 7-pound limit out there, you're the next Kevin Van Dam. Just ask Bill Lowen.
You just said it.
There's too much now.
Dirty water. If you want to grow plants, you got to have sunlight. Why does Thunderbird not have any aquatic vegetation? Because you typically can't see.
But it used to.
Far. It used to.
What changed?
Around the fringe. It was very shallow around the fringe. And just the nature of the soils in this part of the state, when that vegetation died off, the wind, the wave action, whatever, keeps that the clay
turbidity in the water is enough to where nothing can get established.
Right. And we spent 10 years trying to reestablish aquatic plants in a lot of lakes in Oklahoma. And you just can't grow plants without sunlight.
Fair point.
If you get a cattail or something that grows up above the surface, that's one thing. But what we really want are the submerged plants that are underwater, the leafy stuff that provides that nursery habitat that we talked about earlier. And you got to have the sunlight to be able to do that. And so you may have lakes that have lots of nutrients coming in, but if you don't have the sunlight, that energy from the sun that starts the whole food chain process, it's not going to produce any more fish.
And then the big fish. So I always saw like a lake like Thunderbird. I think there's a lot of lakes that are out there like that. An older lake, not a great fish population, but a tournament lake. But like for Thunderbird there for 5 or 6 years, you'd see a lot of 6 to 8 pound. You've caught a 10-pounder out of there, Gene. Lot of 6 to 8 pounders. Like for 3 or 4 years, the Wednesday nighters, 2 for 13.5. But out of 30 boats, no one would have a 3 fish limit. It'd just be like 1 or 2. Are those fish that were stocked into that lake and that's that generation like how does that dynamic work where you have an older lake that has crazy amount of big ones and nothing else?
Think about your Falcon and Amistad example. When we have a drought and you get stuff growing up around the shoreline, when you get a refill, you might get one really good spawn off.
Okay, so I went to college at OU. I got here in 05, 06. Didn't have a boat. Went down to Lake Thunderbird and was like, I can walk around the whole bank. It was really, really low for a really long time. By the time I graduated, was starting to fish the Wednesday nighters and this stuff was happening. We're talking 2012 to like 2016 or 17. When I was walking around that bank in 06, the reason we were catching those fish in 2012 to 2015 was because of that drought 7 years earlier.
Is because when it refilled, you got a pulse of fish, good spawns off, and then 3, 4, 5, 6 years later, on average, it takes about 3 years to grow a 14-inch bass in most parts of largemouth we're talking about. So when you have really good fishing, if you got a lot of 5-pounders, those fish might be 5 or 6 years old, let's say.
All year class, 1 year class, 1 or 2 year class.
Typically, right. And it's from something good that happened several years ago. And so it's not like they just magically, all of a sudden, some kind of stocking truck showed up and dumped in trophy bass. It's because of what went on maybe as much as a decade earlier. Or in the case of what you're talking about here at Lake Thunderbird, 3, 5, 6 years, something like that. And a lot of fishermen don't think about, oh yeah, I remember in 2013, we had a big rainy year and the lake came up and it flooded all the bushes. And the biologist is saying, yeah, that's when you got a really good spawn off that year. And now you're seeing the results of it.
Okay. I don't think I've ever said this, but this makes total sense now. Grand coincided with the first Elite Series came here in 06 and then 07, 09. You've got a bunch of people on Grand that are saying, man, professional tour started coming here, wrecked the freaking lake. Now it's hard to catch them. If you go back and look, though, so when I first moved here, this is just a case study because I moved here during that. Like I started fishing the Nichols in 11, 12. There was a couple years there. You can go back and look at it where 80 or 90 boats had over 17 pounds. And it was still taking only 22 to win. There was one year, I think 80 boats had 20-pound bags and it took 23 to win. Then that slowly has drifted away. Mm-hmm. If you go back and look 3 or 5, 4 to 6 years before that, I bet based on what you said, there would be a natural event in that Northeast Oklahoma area that allowed for 2-year classes of incredibly good spawns. Everybody is like, this is the freaking lake. And then all of a sudden those fish that in Grand typically top out around 5 or 6 pounds before they get harvested, die of natural causes, that type of thing. And everybody's going, oh, the lake's going to crap. No, you just had a phenomenal influx of year classes of fish. And now it's going back. It's like fishing tackle sales during COVID, right, Gene?
Right.
And now everyone's like, oh, my company's, no, it's going back to pre-COVID numbers because people are doing normal stuff now.
Right.
Am I right on that?
No, you're exactly right. And you have those cycles and they're not a regular cycle. It's, floods, droughts, or things that don't happen on a very regular basis. And so you may have 2 or 3 years of really good production. We've had high water during the summer. You get great survival of fish. That translates into more keeper fish then 3 to 5 years later. Well, then you get 2 or 3 drought years, and now you've got a weak year class or two in there. And so 3 to 5 years later, all of a sudden, you're not catching as many of the keeper size fish as you were because they're just not there. The other thing that has happened on a lot of lakes, and Grand is a perfect example. When I first started fishing Grand way back, there were miles and miles of shorelines covered with willows. They bulldoze all the willows and planted condos now. And so a huge amount of the cover that was there when the lake came up and flooded in the summertime that provided that nursery area for little bass is gone. We, Oklahoma Wildlife Department and GRDA spent years trying to reestablish aquatic vegetation, but Grand Lake's one of those lakes that goes up and down like a yo-yo, and we're never successful in getting plants established. So the habitat has changed in the last 30 years, and everybody thinks about the good old days. Well, things have changed pretty drastically in terms of the lake itself. The habitat has changed. And so add that, tournament pressure from a number of these lakes that get a lot of tournaments, whether it's high schools or the bigger events. there have been enough studies now showing that changes the behavior of fish. It may not change the numbers so much as it does the behavior of where they live, how they react to anglers, to lures, to bait. You know, when we were at Okeechobee at the elite tournament back in February, the biologist that manages Lake Okeechobee, he's an avid bass fisherman, and he said it's amazing how you can go out there and just sit and watch a bunch of guys fishing, and the guys be throwing artificial lures and not catch a thing. And a guy with shiners will come in behind them and just start mopping them up. Those fish have become conditioned to not eat artificial lures, but they know what a shiner is. And so the fish are still there, but they don't fish the same as they did 10, 20, 30 years ago. And as fishing has changed.
This is interesting. So you're saying the fishing pressure or the tournament pressure is not necessarily killing the fishery. It's not like, oh, we're taking these fish and we're moving them and they're not there anymore. What you're saying that the tournament pressure is doing is changing the behavior of the fish. That's freaking massive.
Now, I will say that there is some study going on now and potentially some impacts to the fishery that we haven't really recognized until fairly recently. How do I explain this? Okay. If you think of the fish population as a pyramid, there's a lot of fish down here at the bottom of the pyramid, and there's fewer and fewer as you get up to the top of the pyramid, the trophy size fish. Well, tournaments don't fish for the little guys down here. You want to catch these bigger ones up here. If a certain percentage of those fish do die because of tournaments, then we're kind of taking the top off of the pyramid a little bit. The numbers down here, when you look at a shocking survey or something, maybe the total numbers aren't that different.
Right.
But you might not have as many of the great big fish at the very top end because the tournament mortality, since there's fewer of them, the mortality may be cropping some of those off. I think about a Grand Lake. I mean, you've been up there in the fall. You can walk across the lake on the shad.
Yeah.
It's not a food problem.
Nope.
Okay. But Grand Lake very seldom produce fish over 6 or 7 pounds, maybe 8 pounds. Very seldom ever saw, the big bass in tournaments at Grand
6.5 to 7
is typically not really big. So is that because of something naturally going on, or
I figured it was genetics?
Is it genetics, or is it because the tournament pressure is so great that we're kind of cropping off some of those bigger fish over decades? Really, it doesn't happen overnight. And those are some of the kind of questions there's some research now going on in some of the lakes. I think in South Carolina and Tennessee, that they're looking at some of those kind of things to see, what those impacts are. Up until now, all the studies that have been done on bass tournaments, looking at the total population, like you take a larger size reservoir, there's sort of it's kind of got a built-in buffer. There's a lot of fish in there that aren't being fished for. So it kind of depends on each lake. Like I said, each lake's going to be a little different.
All right. We'll take a final break of the show, and we come back. Like I said, we could go hours and hours on this. We're an hour and a half in on it. I want to talk about the Bass Fishing Hall of Fame scholarships that are available, because I know that's something near and dear to your heart, is getting people who care about the stuff that we care about into positions that can make a difference. Is that a good way to say it, Jim?
Yeah.
So we'll take our final break of the show. BTL on a Tuesday with B.A.S.S. Conservation Director Gene Gilliland. We'll be back right after this. Have you considered purchasing new electronics for your rig? The type of mounts you choose to protect your investment should be part of the decision-making process. No matter if you prefer 1, 2, or 3 graphs up front, Beatdown Outdoors has a solution for you. Adjustable, versatile, rigid, and made in the USA. What's your ultimate electronic setup? Check out the full selection of Beatdown Outdoors products by visiting beatdownoutdoors.com.
Having confidence in your tackle while on the water is one of the main things to success, in my opinion. In the last couple of years with Denali, I've had just that. From anything from spinning rods, casting rods, tungsten products, even now to casting and spinning reels, I have the confidence to go out there and get the job done and know that all my equipment is going to handle it and do it just the way I want it. The thing about Denali is you've got great quality products at a great price point, so make sure you check them out. I'm the kind of guy that never leaves a house without a pocket knife, and Gamakatsu's come out with the EDC series of knives. EDC stands for everyday carry, so whether you're on the water or off, you can always have it with you. The best thing about it to me is that assisted open feature. With this D2 blade, you've got it right here at your fingertips, so if you can't find your scissors, you need to cut a knot, you need to cut your braid, you've always got it. Make sure you check it out. Never leave home without your Gamakatsu EDC knife.
Born in Japan, using technology, innovation, and precision, Sunline produces the widest selection of fishing lines at the most technologically advanced line factory in the world. Manufactured at the strictest tolerances to produce victories at the highest levels of tournament bass fishing. From household names like Christie, Swindle, and Cruz, to young guns like Cook, Logan, New, and Welcher, they all trust Sunline to take them to the top of the leaderboard. Choose the line that will give you the strength to guarantee your confidence. Sunline.
All right, welcome back, BTL on a Tuesday, talking with B.A.S.S. Conservation Director Gene Gilliland. You've been doing this, how many years have you been involved with some level of fisheries biology, state agencies, bass, 40?
40, yeah.
Does it feel like 40 years? I mean, it's what you love to do, though, right?
Do I feel I'm an old fart now. Yeah, hell, I got hearing aids.
Well, think about the difference between what you guys did 40 years ago and what we're doing now. Is
worlds
insane.
Worlds of difference. The technology has improved. Certainly the DNA stuff that's going on now, and a lot of that has changed. But one thing I know over the long history of my career is that managing fish is not the hard part. It's managing people. That's the toughest part. And from a fishery biologist standpoint, we all got into it because we love to hunt and fish and that sort of thing.
I want to close the show out by talking about the Bass Fishing Hall of Fame scholarship opportunities that are available for those. You're a 2021 Bass Fishing Hall of Fame inductee. But I wanted to kind of give you the opportunity to talk about the scholarship opportunities that are available through the end of this month for people who are looking to get into fisheries biology. Mm-hmm. Specifically, I mean, ideally, right? Like bass and what you do. Like you need more people to follow in your footsteps, because even though you said it's a small slice of the pie, it's a very important slice of the pie.
Right. Well, the real key to that thing is we want anglers who want to be biologists.
Anglers who want to be biologists. That's the key. Okay. So talk about that scholarship opportunity available if you know or are someone, because we got a lot of people in that 15 to 25 age group, or people who have created people that are in that age group.
Right.
So talk about it.
Oh, we ready?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, we're
I'm
good.
sorry. The Bass Fishing Hall of Fame this year decided to utilize some of the money that we have collected over the past several years through our banquets and auctions to make a scholarship available to students who are either going into college or who are already in college, either at the undergraduate or in graduate school, who are majoring in natural resources or in particular fisheries management.
Okay.
And that's one of the requirements, is that they have to be enrolled in a college or university that in a program that is for fisheries managers. And their stated goal in life is to become a practicing biologist at a state or federal agency. not to go on to be a professor in college or not to go on and be some kind of a farm pond consultant or whatever. And part of the reason we started this was because a lot of the state agencies are having a hard time finding qualified applicants for biologist positions, as the old generation, like my counterparts, are almost all retired now, and they're leaving the profession. And states are having a hard time finding really good qualified candidates to fill those jobs. And the other component of that is we're looking for people who are anglers, because it's not enough to just know the biology. You got to know the customer.
Mm-hmm.
And there are a lot of biologists out there now that are not anglers. They know the biology backwards and forwards, but they don't understand fishing and the sport of fishing and how that relates to the fish populations. And so the state agencies came to us several years ago and said, man, what can we do to help encourage getting more anglers who want to become fish biologists involved? And we said, hey, let's put together a scholarship program. So the Bass Fishing Hall of Fame started that this year. There is an application form on the Bass Fishing Hall of Fame website, which is
bassfishinghof.com.
Right. And the deadline is the end of May 31st for getting those applications in. We have set aside $25,000 for this scholarship program. I don't know at this point how much we're going to be able to award each of the applicants. If we get 5, we may give them $5,000 a piece.
That's substantial.
Pretty good scholarship. If we get 25 that are all really good, we may give them $1,000 a piece. We don't, until we get all the applicants in. I have not gotten very many. Typically the kids are going to wait till the very last minute.
I got you.
But right now we've only gotten a handful of applications in. So there's certainly opportunity there. So if any of the listeners, viewers have either are already in school in fisheries management, or know somebody that fits that's an angler that's looking to get into fisheries biology in college, we've got a scholarship that's tailor-made for them, and we're really looking for getting the word out and letting more people know about it and getting more applications.
bassfishinghof.com.
Right.
That's good stuff. Every time I get you in here, I'm like, dude, we need to do this more often, because I nerd out and always learn a bunch, and I'm never sure what direction we're going to go down.
Yeah.
There was several directions I thought we were going to go down that we didn't. So if you're willing to jump back on in the future,
I'd be glad to.
It's I love talking
not that
about
far.
it. I also like fishing with you. Like I said, I have taken a picture of a 10-pounder you caught, and then you also just posted that you just caught 30 pounds on a topwater out of Oklahoma. So I was very jealous of that fish looked. You and your wife love to go out and fish.
She didn't get to go with me that day, so she's pretty jealous too.
Frog and buzzbait.
Yeah.
That's strong.
Second cast, 7.5 pounder on a buzzbait, and then the third cast on a frog caught another 7 pounder. So it was one of those kind of magical mornings. Caught them all in an hour.
All right. Thanks for sticking with us through, like I said, some buffering issues as we get back to normal here following the tornadoes that went through, well, pretty much the entire heart of Oklahoma. We were talking before the show about you were out of town taking care of some fisheries business, and it was one headed straight towards your neck of the woods.
While the wife was in the closet.
Yeah. And then this one that came a mile from here, but really good stuff. And I hope people actually heard what was being said here, because I think in some instances there's a lot of people that get blamed for stuff that they have no control over, especially when it comes to those agencies. Like if you're talking about the fish and the lakes, and it's just the tournament's fault that this lake used to be good and now it's not.
Mm-hmm.
Not necessarily the case.
Well, yeah, and a lot of people blame their state agency for not doing a good job, and one of the things I always push back on is that those guys don't have a reason to make fishing bad.
Yeah.
The biologists, their agencies are funded by the sale of fishing licenses, and so they want fishing to be good.
Mm-hmm. Are you headed to any of the upcoming Elite Series events?
Actually, I'm going to take a big part of the summer off. The next Elite I'm going to go to is going to be St. Clair, and then the 2 in New York. But I do have I've got a Bass Nation tournament. I'm going to work on the Arkansas River next week.
Oh, that'll be fun.
And so I don't go to all the tournaments. They're just too many. So I kind of get to cherry pick the ones that I need to go to, and in between meetings and all that other stuff that I do.
Yep. All right. Hit everybody again with the information if they have some legit questions. I will warn you, other people have given out their emails on BTL.
I don't mind.
Several have regretted it.
I don't mind. I don't
Okay.
mind. You know, because if you get stuff that you don't like, you can hit that block thing.
Okay. Yep.
It's GGILLILAND at bassmaster.com.
Gene Gilliland, thank you for jumping on BTL. Like I said, you've been around for a long time, since before I was around with Mark Jeffries at the Bass Ode, and saw it all from the beginning all the way through. So thank you for coming to the new studio.
Yeah, cool.
In Shawnee, Oklahoma.
Yep. Looking good.
Greatly appreciated. All right, this has been another edition of BTL Bass Talk Live. Tomorrow, Jeremy Lawyer jumps on. He's underrated, interesting. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. He's one of those dudes who you get around and there's a bunch of good storytellers, and he's the guy that ends up telling the stories, where the other dudes who are normally telling the stories are like into his stories. That's how I think you can tell who a good storyteller is, when you get a room full of storytellers, who's the one that all the guys who are normally telling the stories listening to. It's Jeremy Lawyer. So we'll have Jeremy Lawyer on him. Plus, he's a heck of a fisherman, too.
Oh, yeah.
And he's been really good Ozark area dude for the last couple of years. So, all right, we will talk to everybody tomorrow. Jeremy Lawyer, thank you, Gene. See you.
You're very welcome.